I'm Sybil Seitzinger. I'm the Executive Director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, located here in British Columbia. And this session will address the question of how is renewable energy changing our thinking about energy in cities. And specifically, we're going to talk about some of the dimensions that really haven't been highlighted quite so much throughout this day, which is underserved, disadvantaged communities. We're here in beautiful Vancouver and downtown, very prosperous, but even as we heard from Mayor Gregor Robertson this morning, 20% of children in Vancouver live in poverty. So, we're going to turn our attention to what are the changes and opportunities in the transition to new renewable energy in less advantaged communities in the global south and disadvantaged communities right here in North America. And we have two inspirational and bold speakers on our panel today, both from very powerful NGOs. So we're delighted that we have with us Jody Van Horne, who is the director of the Sierra Club's Ready 100, and Michael Westphal, who's a senior associate with the World Resources Institute. Right. So we were also heard just yesterday that our third panelist, due to illness, is not able to join us today. But I'm sure that we'll have great discussion going on. So the rollout is going to be that they're both going to give some opening remarks, about 10 minutes or so each. Then we'll have a little bit of dialogue between them, and I'll maybe ask some questions myself. But then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So there'll be roaming mics as in previous sessions. So why don't we start with Jody?
Great. Thank you for the introduction. I hope we are bold and inspiring. You guys can applause-a-meter at the end and decide that for yourselves. My name is Jody Van Horne. I'm the director of a campaign at Sierra Club US called the Ready for 100 campaign. And our network of my team and our network of clean energy advocates are working in cities across the United States on to build a movement for 100% renewable energy and to help increase the number of cities that are working on that transition. And there are about 28 cities in the United States that have made a commitment to that to date. And I was asked to speak today a little bit about what role equity plays in a transition to 100% renewable at the city level, and to share some of the efforts that are underway to integrate equity more centrally into energy solutions, which I believe, unfortunately, despite the title of this session, is not yet conventional thinking, but most definitely needs to become so. I will start also by saying that I am not an expert on this topic, but my organization and I personally are working very hard to center equity and justice in the work that we do, which is not an easy undertaking for an organization that is 130 years old and has done things in a certain way, but it is an imperative. And I'm also one of the co-founders of a national network in the United States called the 100% NGO Network, which brings together big environmental organizations like the Sierra Club with frontline and environmental justice organizations, and as well as other racial and economic justice organizations and intermediaries that are working to address together. We're working to address this very question of how do you make sure that equity is centered in all of the energy transition work that is happening. And our coordinator, our network coordinator, Aiko Schaefer, is here. I don't know if she's in the room, but she is here at the conference today, so if you get a chance, say hi to Aiko. I'm going to also share a little bit about what I'm learning and some of the solutions that I've learned about from our equity partners through the 100% network, and also in the field where we're doing our work. But this is not an exhaustive list. And I will say that, let me see if I'm supposed to be on another slide. No, we're good. So the clean energy economy is not immune from the broader political and economic trends that disadvantage some people and reward others, and to build a movement with the power to achieve 100% renewable energy in cities all across my country, and I would argue the globe. Really, all people must believe that the clean energy economy is one in which their needs will be met, and in which they'll be secure. And market forces alone are not going to create a fair and just transition to 100% renewable energy. For that to happen, we have to work for it, and we have to deliberately plan and carry out strategies that foster transition to healthier, renewable communities while simultaneously addressing social and economic and racial injustice. Get my pointer here. And this may be something obvious to all in the room, but was not to me when I started this work, that equity and equality are not the same thing, that we can only build an equitable energy system if we recognize that some groups are already at a disadvantage. And so how and where we invest as we make our choices in this transition to clean energy and how we prioritize solutions matters a great deal. Transition to 100% renewable energy can bring wealth and community benefits to all. It should offer equitable access to the co-benefits of clean energy, of good jobs, of lower energy prices, business opportunities, and healthier communities. But we need to put the policies and strategies in place to ensure that they do. And one of those is ensuring that there is an equitable and inclusive process in the way that we plan to get there. Equitable and inclusive processes lead to more equitable and inclusive solutions, because people who are most impacted by these issues tend to be the best equipped to identify the right solutions. And as cities develop climate and clean energy plans, it's very critical to conduct authentic community engagement. I know many of you who are working for local governments are doing so, and ensure that representation from the groups most affected influences the outcomes of your planning processes. And as a best practice, there should be resources for those communities to be active members at the decision-making table. The City of Portland has an Office of Equity and Human Rights that provides education and technical support to city staff and elected officials, and the City of Boulder is working with the CU Boulder Just Transition Collaborative to ensure that equity is a central part of their transition to 100% renewable energy, which was a goal that my campaign worked with the City of Boulder on, and they adopted late last year. And then there are groups in our networks, like the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, that are working with cities and community-based organizations to develop models for participatory and equitable transitions to 100% renewable energy. So there are resources out there that I encourage, best practices and resources that I encourage everyone to take a look at. The utility sector in the United States is actually one of the few remaining sectors where there is high union density. 27% of workers employed in the utility sector are represented by unions compared to 11% economy-wide. And while there are now over 250,000 jobs in solar in the United States, which is more than employed by the coal industry, we really need to make sure that those jobs are quality career jobs. And that there's economic security for working people as this transition proceeds. We also need to make sure that there are targeted hire programs that make sure that there are union standards and that also help to get low-income workers into these careers. There are such programs, community workforce agreements, that really constitute a formal and legally binding labor management agreement between a developer and the project head. So these models exist, and an example of that is that We were a partner, the Sierra Club was a partner in a coalition of building trade unions, environmental justice, and low-income worker advocacy organizations that successfully advocated for a priority hire legislation in Seattle in 2015. Some of you may be familiar with this. The labor equity law requires that the city's construction contractors hire workers from economically distressed zip codes and to perform 20% of all work hours under the project labor agreements. There's also the issue, of course, that in a transition from a fossil fuel-based society to a clean energy economy, there will be a loss in jobs in conventional energy sectors. And so the federal government in the United States has historically provided traditional transition assistance to support dislocated workers. And of course, as is the case with many programs that existed prior to November, we are looking at, how can we develop more solutions and protections for those workers at the local level should those federal support systems disappear. And one solution for local governments is to establish community economic revitalization teams that coordinate between community stakeholders, unions, businesses, local and state and federal government. And this really gives affected communities agency over the redevelopment of their economies through local administrative bodies. It's also, of course, incredibly important that communities and households have the ability to afford the electricity as we increase our use of renewables and increase energy efficiency, and that this actually requires goal setting. It's not a given that all communities will have access or that energy will be affordable to all communities. And right now, based on a review of 48 major U.S. metropolitan areas released by ACEEE, our Energy Efficiency Council, found that low-income households spend 3 times as much energy and as much money for energy as other higher-income households, and that in particular impacts African American communities and Latino communities in the U.S. And then this chart is by another organization that works to develop low-income solar projects, Groundswell. They determined that toll is even higher, as much as 10% of income for low-income families spent on electricity, which is more than 4 times higher than the average customer as a percentage of their income. So comprehensive energy affordability programming is needed, and public financing programs should redirect money saved from energy efficiency and renewable energy measures to fund more community-owned clean energy, low-income projects, transportation, and especially where there's the greatest financial need. One example of a kind of creative approach from municipalities in Minnesota, both to control and, wow, 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to skip that example and go right to my next slide. Happy to maybe bring it up in the Q&A, but in terms of access, many low-income people in the U.S., and particularly communities of color, are the victim of predatory utility policies and experience shutoffs because they can't pay their high and rising electricity bills. This is a graph from a utility in Colorado serving 21 communities in southeastern Colorado, Black Hills Energy. It's a South Dakota-based utility. We worked very closely with the community of Pueblo, which ran a campaign and successfully worked with their city council to establish a 100% renewable energy goal, but not because they wanted to stop climate change or really because clean energy was their top priority, but because they were experiencing such high utility rates. Since 2008, they've undergone 3 rate increases that have all been approved by the Public Utility Commission in Colorado, mostly to cover the costs of building new natural gas infrastructure. And those rate increases have made this community struggle a lot with their utility bills, already a community that's economically depressed and has higher rates than the rest of Colorado. And so what you're seeing here is that every quarter, 1,600 there are 1,600 utility shutoffs as a result of not being able to pay, being late on their utility bills, and only about half of those get reconnected, which of course leads to homelessness. And in fact, it was the homeless shelter, Posada, in Pueblo that initiated the Coalition for Energy Justice and eventually won their commitment to 100% renewable energy as a way to lower electricity rates and really get the city to take back more authority and control over what was happening to the people of Pueblo.
So I think you can, any final remarks we can do at the end.
Great.
Great. Thank you, Jody. Thank you. Michael.
Hello. There we go. So first I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to the Renewable Cities program here. And while my slides are coming up, I'm based in Portland, but it's very nice to come to this end of Cascadia. So I work for the World Resources Institute, which is a global research organization based in Washington, D.C. And we work on 6 global challenges, and cities is one of our most prominent programs. So I'm going to change gears a little bit here and talk about the role of distributed renewable energy in addressing energy access needs in the global south. And this work that I'm presenting is part of a larger flagship report we do every few years called the World Resources Report. And the current one is on cities, towards a more equal city, which we presented in Quito at Habitat 3, the very first paper of this report. So a little outline here. I'll talk about the current state of electricity access, reliability, and affordability in the global south. I'll talk about how distributed renewable energy can serve or help the underserved. And then I'll talk a little bit about prospects going forward and what's different now about this moment for renewable energy. So first, I think this is all intuitive to everyone here, is energy powers the city. It's essential for economic productivity and livelihood. This just shows the relationship between electricity per capita and GDP per capita in the mega cities of the world. But I would say that energy access at the urban level is really an overlooked problem. It's an overlooked development problem. We hear a lot about rural electricity access being a problem, but it's a huge issue in the global south. So in 2012, almost 130 million people lacked access to electricity. And access is really not just a numbers game, not just a number of connections. It's really about quality. So even when people do have access, they lack reliability, frequent power outages, unreliable grids in parts of Latin America, South Asia. 15% of electricity could be lost in transmission and distribution. Very unreliable grids. The poor urban households often spend anywhere from 14 to 22% of their incomes on energy. We typically consider a household energy poor if it spends more than 10%. And Jody alluded to some of the numbers in the United States. And the urban underserved often have to rely on very dirty forms of energy, diesel, kerosene for lighting, especially. So this just shows where urban electricity access is less than 90%. So in sub-Saharan Africa, only 72% of the urban population has access to electricity. If we look at just very low-income countries, it's 58%. So why do we think that distributed renewable energy can help solve some of these access issues? Our focus is really on solar PV for a couple of reasons. We recognize there are lots of other distributed renewable technologies, microgrids, wind turbines in some cases, district heating, district cooling. But solar PV probably has the greatest potential of distributed renewables in the global south. The IEA estimates that by 2050, 30% of cities' electricity needs globally could be met by solar PV. And so it has potential to address affordability. I mentioned the cost of electricity is an issue in the Global South. In some places, just the connection cost is more than 100% of monthly income. So even if households can afford monthly bills, they might not be able to afford to get that initial connection. Households often have to rely on diesel generation as backup power because of the intermittent grid, because they don't have connections. The levelized cost of diesel is greater than renewable energy in almost all non-OECD countries. So compared to diesel, solar PV would be more affordable. There are safety benefits, less reliance on kerosene, which is quite dangerous for poisoning and fires. Particularly when you're talking about off-grid solar PV, provides reliability over an intermittent grid, and it provides backup power. And then lastly, there are productivity benefits. In many places in the Global South, a lot of people work in home-based enterprises that often can be fairly energy intensive. I would say, though, that we're not talking about distributed renewables as a substitute for enhancing grid connection. They're complementary. In the near future, we'll not be able to hook up everyone to solar PV. But I would say that the grids have often failed to deliver electricity to the urban underserved. So we need complementary approaches. So in terms of prospects going forward, what's different now about this moment? And I think the first thing is declining costs, and we've heard a little bit about that. These data are from the IEA. So we know solar panel PV panels have declined about 75% from 2009 to 2014. Battery costs are declining 20% per year. This just shows that the cost of rooftop solar PV is already competitive with natural gas-based generation in India and China. It's declining globally. So we see there's a strong case that the economics of solar PV is becoming much more favorable. There we go. Secondly, I think we see a greater political commitment. Many cities are committing to climate action. And it's not just cities in the global north. We have wonderful cities, Vancouver, Portland, where I live. But you see it in the global south. If you look at the Compact of Mayors, more than 600 cities have agreed to make climate commitments. That's about 500 million people. There's also this realization that urban energy access is really fundamental to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 7 is about assuring access to modern energy for all. And goal number 11 is about how do we create a resilient, inclusive city. I would argue that if you don't address urban energy access, you're not addressing those goals. And then thirdly, I think we see a plethora of new finance and business models. Many of them are just in their nascent stages. One is consumer finance, pay-as-you-go. It's really scaled up in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, often using mobile phones, mobile banking. In sub-Saharan Africa, in 1 year, in 2015, you saw a doubling of households that use PayGo to connect to solar PV. Net metering offers the opportunity for consumers, not just for people not just to be consumers of electricity, but to be prosumers, to get some value for that. We see an array of third-party financing models. Rooftop rental is something you see in Delhi, combined with net metering. And then in cases where individuals don't have the financial capacity or available rooftop space, as you would find in many informal settlements, community shared solar is one model where people can pool resources to procure solar within the city or actually outside the city. So, I mean, a lot of these models are very new, but we do see a takeoff. And there are many examples of cities in the global south where this is happening. I think I'll conclude there. I would just like you to point to this report that will be forthcoming as part of the World Resources Report paper, what we're calling Energizing Cities for All, which should be released in the next month or two. But thank you very much for your time.
So, Michael's just, Michael has just talked about the Global South and some of the opportunities and challenges there, and you've talked about the United States, and after having listened to each other, what would you say we can learn from each other and the lessons learned from working in, looking at communities in the Global South and looking at disadvantaged portions of communities or whole communities in North America? What can we learn? This is about co-learning here at this forum.
I think I'll maybe start, but I think one of the things that stands out to me is the focus on more local and personal control over the energy system. And I think, kind of a section of my long presentation that I didn't get to was really about models of ownership that enable more community empowerment and decision-making over energy and over electricity use. And I think that in the Global South, because that map that showed vast swaths of continents that are not currently electrified or using any power, there's the ability to build a more decentralized and distributed energy system from scratch. Here in the U.S., to move there, we have to move from there in the U.S., down there, we have to move from a very centralized energy system to a decentralized energy system. And while that would enable communities to have more say in energy production and consumption, it's not a given without the right policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks to enable it. And we're not right now in most states in the country, which is the level at which most of our energy decisions are set. We don't have robust frameworks to enable shared renewable energy systems, community solar, and for those projects to be cost effective and help save communities money. It's something that many communities are fighting for, but it's not as easy. But I think it is a shared opportunity and a shared solution that there might be something to learn from.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just to echo a few points. I mean, one lesson certainly is that community engagement is vital. I mean, that's one reason why, if you look at informal areas or slums in the Global South, that's one reason why they're not serviced. They have no part in participatory processes. I think another lesson is that technology is part of this transformation we're talking about, but it's really not the most important part of it, I think. It requires lots of other enablers. So I talked about finance, but it's these inclusive institutions, it's capacity. There are lots of issues around political economy that I think, elite capture that I think translate here in North America as well. A while back, C40 did a survey, and they asked their member cities, how many of you have direct control of your municipal energy? And I think it was something like 40%. And even in the Global South, that's probably even more pronounced because local governments often have much less control over energy planning, over their energy resources. It tends to be more centralized, the governance structure. So they actually have less empowerment. And that's a big issue, is the lack of local empowerment, lack of cities being able to engage, being able to influence the policy process. It's changing in some places, but that's still a big issue. Often cities can't access finance directly in the Global South. They don't have either they lack creditworthiness or they're not allowed to by the national government. So that really hamstrings cities.
Yeah. So I have another question, which is, before we turn it over to the audience for questions, which is, You know, we talk about the importance of energy and energy access as being important for economic development, for livelihoods. And what can you give us any examples of where you've seen or you know about when you do have some renewable energy coming into a community? You know, what changes in the balance of power or the ability of those communities to kind of take more control of their livelihoods or their be more productive? You know, can you give us some examples of where we've really seen that happen?
Well, I mean, if you look at informal settlements in the global south, there's a lot of documentation about when households have access to lighting, you know, school girls can study, women have much more ability to do work. So we know that there are all these sort of social benefits associated with providing lighting to the households. In some of the work we looked at in Indonesia, it was clear that if you could provide more energy to a household, then they actually can be more productive, because at home they would be involved in processing agricultural products. They'd be involved in tempeh in Indonesia. They'd be involved in textiles and that sort of thing. So you provide more energy to the household. There's a massive energy deficit. You provide more energy to the household, there certainly are major productivity benefits. But the social benefits are well documented, where children can actually use light to study, and lighting is really important for safety. Women's safety is a major issue in the global south in some of these communities. So I think you have a lot of gender and welfare impacts.
Great. Jody, do you have an example that you'd like to give us?
Yeah, I mean, I have one example that's more about the empowerment that came from being engaged in the decision making, which I referenced the community of Pueblo, Colorado, and when I first visited Pueblo, and I was given a tour of the city, and it was kind of a tour of the energy justice issues in the city, and the local resident who took me on this tour said, there's just a tremendous amount of resignation because this situation has been this way for a very long time, and for the last 8 years we've seen our rates go up 3 times, and nobody here feels that we have any power to actually fight back against that, or to block an additional rate hike, or that there's any voice, because a lot of these decisions happen in kind of arcane decision-making venues that at the state level or the regulatory level that is not a participatory or very democratic process. People could go, but most people don't know that they can go. And when they, after many months, over 12 months and really years, but mounting a public education campaign and holding energy education forums at the public library and engaging the residents of Pueblo in this issue, and really helping people see that there was a way to have a voice, and that the representatives of Pueblo, the city council, could appoint a liaison to the utility and actually represent them in public utility commission hearings. They blocked their first ever in 8-year proposed rate increase, and turned out 300 people to the public utility commission hearing. And that really changed a lot in terms of the energy and the mindset of the possibilities in the city. And it's just the beginning. Setting the 100% renewable energy commitment and seeing that they could achieve that doesn't mean things change overnight for all residents, but I think what it did, according to the group that was working on this and organizing theirs, it gave people a sense of their ability to influence and impact their future that they didn't have before, before that win, and before that happened.
Okay, great. So we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions. Do we have a couple of questions? We'll take 2 questions, and then you can direct it at a particular one of the panelists, or you can do it to both of them. And please remember to identify yourself before you start your question, and please make your question succinct. So do we have some questions from the audience? I know it's late in the day. Yes, we have a question here, and
Hear about your example that you were going to say about Minneapolis.
I was going to say...
wait, we're going to get two questions.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
So we have one question here, and we have another question. You know, if you don't raise your hand, I'll have to pick on somebody. You know, that's never... Okay, here we have another question. Great.
Jason Emmert with Metro Vancouver. I have a question about whether the proliferation of solar PV at the kind of household level or on a distributed level creates a disincentive for investment by the utilities. And you had described that that we need that investment from the utilities, and they're not one or the other. And can you just talk about that dynamic a bit?
Okay. Who would like to answer which question? I guess one of the questions was specifically to you, Jody.
Sure. So I was going to give the example that the first ever attempt by municipalities in the U.S. to aggregate their demand and collectively purchase community solar through solar gardens is ongoing in Minnesota, but there were 31 local governments that set out to buy 180 megawatts of solar collectively. And so the results of that were that every community that signed a 25-year contract with a community solar developer collectively is going to save money over the long run. And in some community cases, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, up to $1 million over the life of that contract. So it was an illustration of how there are creative solutions that municipalities are collectively now pursuing to lower the costs and save money with more local generation, local control over the energy system.
Okay, and then the question that was in the back?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's clear that distributed renewables, I think, challenge the utility business model, globally. But I think you have to remember, a lot of these places we're talking about, the utilities aren't serving them, right, in informal areas. Utilities can't, they are very reluctant to serve informal areas because of issues on land tenure, because they're worried about electricity being stolen. So it's not the case that utilities want to service these areas, and solar PV will disincentivize them addressing these areas. So these are people who are largely are often ignored by utilities, at least at the in terms of the very poor in cities.
Great, thank you. So do we have a couple more questions? I see Michael's hand up, and do I see another hand out there in the audience?
Hi, my name... Nope. Yes.
Yes.
Hi.
Okay,
My
great.
name's Sarah. I'm from Vancouver. And I have a question about, I see two real trends happening. One is the energy efficiency trend, and the other one is a bit of like a population migration trend going on. And I wonder if both the panelists had any thoughts on, with the people moving to urban centers, is demand for clean electricity going to go up, or with energy efficiency, is it going to go down?
Okay, and then Michael.
I'll just make this a quick observation, and if either the panelists want to comment on it, I've been working through in my mind, Jody, the situation you've talked about and what lies behind it is often a critique that it's the affluent in cities in the United States and Canada that are benefiting, are early adopters, can afford to be prosumers, or it's the affluent communities that are getting on board the renewable energy revolution. And often, certainly I've heard this in your state, in California, utilities that are wanting to kick back will mobilize poor communities to argue that they'll see their rates go up if there's renewable energy being brought in, and can actually use the inequities, in fact, to help reinforce fossil fuel incumbency. And that may be true in other places. In the global south, in the cities you're talking about, the underserved populations, renewable energy actually offers an opportunity to get access to energy where there was none at all.
Yeah.
So it's actually, it offers opportunities for the poor, whereas it looks like a threat to the poor in urban centers in North America, or it is often portrayed as such. And I've just been trying to work through my mind, what's the contrast? What's the explanatory difference? I think it's got something a lot to do with the degree to which access to energy has been made a collective good and is collectively available in the first place, and who owns and controls the utilities. But the paradox, the contrast between the urban underserved you've been talking about, Michael, and the communities that you've been talking about, Jody, is still something that I wanted to kind of think through.
Great.
Maybe I'll address a little bit of that point about people moving to cities. I mean, it's an inexorable trend. So by the middle of the century, 2.5 billion new people will be living in urban areas. So there's a huge challenge to provide energy for all those new urban residents. So we need both. We need obviously we need energy efficiency to kind of bend that demand curve, right? And we need to accelerate clean renewable energy. So we need both. You can't have one without the other.
And what are your thoughts on Michael's question?
Yeah, I mean, I just on the first part, I would say that it is, a myth that it is inherently, it is an argument that utilities make that there is a cost shift from, the wealthy to, the low income with solar, and also it is a broader argument that is made that, or at least was in the past, I think, less so today, but that, renewable energy is only for coastal elites. And, two answers to that. One is that it's not inherently so that policies can be developed in a way that ensures access and affordability for all residents. They need to be built that way. Policy frameworks can change that and can shift that if they are intentionally built to identify where the communities that are at risk or are in need of programs that ensure affordability. And then on the argument that only certain people benefit, I think what we're seeing now is across the U.S. there are very, very diverse communities, including farmers in rural Kansas and Iowa that are making additional income off of wind energy and leasing their land for wind development, and that is providing much needed economic relief in places that have suffered from economic decline. So I think there are many of it. It doesn't mean that the argument isn't perpetuated, but I think that there are many examples that demonstrate that there's that it's not inherently the case, and that it's not necessarily true.
I mean, if I can follow up on that, Michael, that argument that you mentioned in terms of the global north about how renewable energy is really something for the wealthy and it could hurt the poor, that's actually made in the global south as well, because rich people can often self-provision. They self-provision for water. So there is the concern, because there's cross-subsidies for electricity tariffs. There's a concern that if wealthier residents of the city, rely on solar PV, that could affect the ability to subsidize the poor in the city. So those same arguments are made. But I think you're right. The difference is that here everyone has access to electricity, but in so many parts of the global south, that's still not the case. So renewables offer that first chance of connection.
Well, I think
yes,
please.
That's
sure.
just one quick question to Jody, which is a little bit on the financial models. In your work, what have you seen has really been innovative in the United States? What sort of finance and business models that you see being successful?
One example that comes immediately to mind is a company in the Northeast that operates in the kind of northeast of the United States, and particularly started in the Bronx in New York, that because it's hard to attract financing for low-income renewable energy development because of credit issues and investor risk analysis. This company has worked with particularly faith communities and places of worship to aggregate the collective demand of enough of enough projects in enough places in a neighborhood or in an area to attract financing, to lower the risk for investors and attract financing to be able to develop both energy efficiency and solar projects across a community. And then on top of that, they've tagged on and ensured that hiring is happening from the local community. So it's both an economic and jobs development opportunity, and it's bringing renewable energy and energy savings to neighborhoods that on their own were not able to attract individually financing from the banks or from tax equity investors. So it's models like that are starting to enable more development in low-income zip codes, and I think there are many more examples like that.
That's interesting because that the issue of aggregation is a common theme you see in the global south as well. When you talk about carbon market revenues for smallholder farmers, you talk about how do you aggregate enough poor people to make it investor worthy in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really interesting.
Great. Well, great. I think you've opened up our eyes and thoughts to some of the issues that we haven't spoken maybe a lot about at this meeting, but we should be certainly thinking about. A very important issue of equity and overall access and the opportunities that provides. So I think let's thank our panelists for a very stimulating discussion.